Welcome back, dear listener, to Poems and Potions. For our third featured poet, we are going to be speaking with Steve Abbot, a veritable legend within the Columbus poetry scene. If Columbus poetry has a godfather, it's Steve Abbot. Founding member in 1984 of the Poetry Forum, now the Midwest's longest-running poetry series. He is a distinguished professor emeritus in English of Columbus State Community College. His poems have appeared in dozens of literary journals as well as in several anthologies. He received an Ohio Arts Council Excellence Award in Poetry in 1993, and the following year was the first writer to be awarded an OAC residency at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, MA. He has published 5 chapbooks and 2 full-length poetry collections, A Green Line Between Green Fields, and a collection of ekphrastic poems, A Language the Image Speaks. He edited the anthologies Cap City Poets, a collection of 74 Central Ohio poets, and Everything Stops and Listens, containing work by members of Ohio Poetry Association. He also edits OPA's annual journal Common Threads, and in 2015, he represented OPA on the Ohio Arts Council panel, selecting Ohio's first poet laureate. So, welcome to the show, Steve.
Good to be here.
Can you introduce yourself and share a bit about your journey as a poet?
I'm Steve Abbott, and I was writing poetry. I was writing doggerel and really bad poetry probably when I was in my I was probably 9, 10 years old. I would write rhymes for like my sister's birthday cards or something like that. And I became interested in poetry in high school. The textbook we were using in a freshman English course was an anthology of American poetry. And there were certain writers I just found fascinating, and a lot of them were the boilerplates, Whitman, Dickinson, Frost. Some others, William Stafford, W.S. Merwin, Adrian Rich. So from there, though, I just kind of puttered around at poetry and started writing some that was basically bad imitations of beat poets, of Allen Ginsberg, when I was in my late teens, but didn't really start writing poetry seriously until I was over 30 by the time I started getting into it. That would have been in the early 1980s. I started becoming involved in the Columbus poetry scene and got some encouragement from a number of wonderful women who were basically the architects of the poetry scene in Columbus at that time. They organized readings for the Columbus Arts Festival, individual readings here and there. There was also poetry in the park, which I would go to and was interested in. And I'd just begun writing really seriously at that point. And a number of people, including some of these women who'd been kind of coaching me along, invited me to be part of a group starting up a reading at Larry's Bar. And everything went from there. So that's kind of the background of getting into it. And then I started really getting into writing it in a way that was less trying to be, trying to get girls and do things like that. I started really becoming serious about, well, okay, there's material here in the world that I can work with. And I was an imitator. I never took a creative writing course. I just kind of bumbled along with really good support from a lot of really good local poets.
Can you tell me a little more about Poetry in the Park? Was that, I guess I would ask, was it a historical thing? Like, was it a fulcrum point for poetry in Columbus?
I think, Poetry in the Park started in the early 1980s. It was organized by a local poet and now a jazz musician, Michael Vanderdoes. And he was working with the Columbus Recreation Parks Department and basically started this reading series for the summer up at the Whetstone Park of Roses, the gazebo there, and they would have weekly poetry readings. Usually there were two poets. They'd have a sign interpreter, which I always found fascinating, because you'd get them the poems in advance, and so they'd have some sense of what you were going to read, and they didn't have to come up with the signs for what might be some very strange images and things like that on the spot. And I would just, when I did a reading there, I just told people, watch her. I'm terribly uninteresting, but you can listen to me, but watch her. And that was really enjoyable. So that was through several summers in the early 80s. And then Michael Vanderdoes stopped doing that, and another person took it over. It went for several more years, but that was a place where Columbus poets largely could be featured. Now, occasionally, other poets were brought in, and Michael Vanderdoes somehow snagged Allen Ginsberg. And so Allen Ginsberg read at the Park of Roses, and I think the city of Columbus probably made, I don't know, $8,000 or $10,000 on parking tickets that night, because people were parked all along the access road from High Street all the way down into the park. So it was a great evening.
That sounds kind of cool. I would love to see
Well, it's a
something
big
like that
thing,
again.
and it's a lot to learn in a short time, because starting in the late 80s, poetry in Columbus just took off.
So it's kind of interesting to see at least two big phenomenons, one that became writer's block and then one that became the poetry forum.
It was, yeah, that was largely which is sometimes an artificial distinction, but I think it's one that's valid and generally valid and important, which was the poetry forum was always focused more on poetry on the page, and writer's block was more focused on poetry from the stage. And so, it was the difference, I think, in some senses, between sitting down and reading a poem and listening to someone present a poem. And those were kind of the two camps. And there was always crossover, but I think a lot of the hangers-on who were not involved in running the readings and getting them together, they kind of saw it as something competing, whereas the people who were running it was just saying, it's different. We do different things. We cross-pollinate. We support each other's work.
I like that. I'm gonna I'm gonna use that. That's really good.
Yeah, in my experience, it was I had some poems that would work as performance poems. So, I could read those at the poetry forum, but I could also read them at writer's block, where the audience was much more geared to, I think I could describe it as a lot of performance poems or poems that are meant to be heard depend on the personality of the poet as a delivery system to really convey what the poem has going on in it. When I put together that Cap City Poets collection, I had to go back. I went back to Scott actually and said, no, the poem you gave me won't work. Give me this one or that one. Because some work on the page, but some don't. I mean, if you try to put performance poems on the page, because they don't have the kind of delivery that someone like, a Louise Robertson or a Scott Woods or a Zach Hanna has, where the personality is a big part of the poem itself, the poem falls flat on the page.
I can see that definitely. And as far as, playing with the word that I'm using, the way, things that'll make more sense when you see it on the page versus, something I write.
You've got to get that voice right, or people are going to say, what's that guy doing? And part of it is that when you're working with the page, the concept, there's the sight element of it plays a big role, because how people break lines, for example, makes a difference, because you read the line and it says one thing, and then you turn the line and continue in the next one, and it's, oh, there's this whole other dimension to those words that were at the end of the previous line. So there's a lot of that that may not come across as effectively when they're just heard.
And I can see that, especially with I can see that as far as like the enjambment, that kind of stuff. That's something, getting that gravid breath in at the right time before you proceed on to the next line to convey what is on the page. And that also fascinates me. I love that. I'm sorry if this is a repeat question. How did you first begin writing poetry?
Again, it was imitations. I think the easiest way, rather than going all the way back, to say I wrote imitations. And most of them were bad imitations. I was particularly attracted to Whitman and the beat poets. But I also, I appreciated meter and rhyme. And so I went back and forth between those. I was in a garage band my last couple of years in high school. I was the lead singer, and I wrote a couple of bad lyrics for forgettable songs. And but I really was not doing a whole lot of poetry for other people. I was writing some poems that were basically relationship poems, love poems kinds of things. And, a partner or a lover or a spouse is going to appreciate a poem you've created just for them in a very different way than an audience hearing that poem would. And so there was a lot of that. But I really didn't start getting into, again, I was probably around 30 before I really started getting into writing poems with some kind of guidance from other people, and going to workshops and listening to the poems that other people were reading at various readings and saying, oh, okay, well, let me try this, let me try that. I wrote a poem. That's a lot of my early stuff when I was in my 20s was political poetry, so I had a poem that was kind of a tribute to the Columbus Tenants Union on its 5th anniversary, which included, a short litany of bad landlords and things like that. So, and somewhere I have a copy of that, but I only had a few poems that I kept track of. And then with Mary Kenny Rum and Elizabeth Ann James and Carol Beebe, Michael Rosen and Jerry Roscoe, who were active with around the My Back Pages bookstore that was at 16th and High. Steve Fout, Daryl Price, who ran the bookstore, they had readings, and so I'd go to those. I met Jennifer Bosveld, and that was one of the transition points in my life. Jennifer Bosveld was once described as a one-person poetry revolution. I mean, she was a force of nature. She was just relentlessly positive. She'd critique your work, but it was always with encouragement. She and I became best friends. I worked with her a lot on Pudding House, which was the press that she ran, first out of Columbus and then out of Johnstown later on. She published hundreds of chapbooks of poets from all over the country. She was the one who was the drive wheel behind Cap City Poets, which I worked with Rose Smith and Connie Everett, both of whom were later coordinators of the Poetry Forum. But Jennifer, Jennifer opened up poetry to me in a way that I don't think would have happened otherwise. And, I still miss her.
No, I understand that. The inspiration, the people who inspire us. I'm sorry.
Encouragement makes all the difference in the world.
I have to make a little bit of an edit here. We Got a little bit off topic, but I wanted to keep this next part in just because we started talking about other poets and styles and Karen Scott, and this part gives us a little bit of insight into two different types of poets, Karen Scott versus Steve. And for newer poets, this might be something nice to have, and for older poets or just the curious, it's a fun little conversation.
Well, as she said, she's a narrative poet. She's a storyteller. And her work is very personal. And, poets are different that way. I tend not to be very personal in mine. I don't talk a lot about my own life. I might grab incidents from my own life or things that have occurred to me because of social interactions or social and cultural and political things that are going on, but I don't write a whole lot about myself. And so, we have our different ways of approaching that. Karen's is one, very personal, very family based, immediate family and extended family. And she has this very wry outlook on things, and she conveys it very well in her poetry.
She did. I enjoyed that a great deal. And that was the end of our diversion. We're going to get back to the main topic we were talking about.
Again, it grew out of Poetry in the Park. There was also this same group of people, Michael Rose and several other people worked with Kathy Woolley Frank, and she was employed by the Museum of Art. Along with some of these other poets, she organized something called Poets in the Gallery. And they would have readings, in the stairwell, in one of the big stairwells, open spaces at the Museum of Art. And so there were all of these things that were churning around that. With the Poetry Forum, I was still largely a newbie, but probably about half of the group, and there were about 10 people, that formed the Poetry Forum as coordinators. They were mostly friends from the poetry scene. About half of them were much older than I was. And so over a period of a couple of years, they faded away. And, I liked what I was doing and was feeling a lot more confidence about my own work. And so, it was a learning experience of how do you run a poetry reading? What limits can you set on it? How do you structure it in such a way that it's going to serve both your featured poets, but also give people an opportunity in an open mic to do what Poetry Cauldron's doing, which is to allow somebody to say, here's my work. And, if people want to come up afterwards and, you feel you trust them and they're close enough and they say, they pick at the poem a bit and say, you can't, this was kind of muddy in here or something like that. Well, great, that's what you need. If you're going to be, unless you're going to be taking a class in which you have, or a workshop that goes on, beyond like a couple of hours, that is incredibly important. It was important to me, and, Jennifer Bosveld gave me an opportunity at some point, and it was in the 80s. She featured like 6 or 8 of my poems in Pudding magazine. They would often do an issue that featured a particular poet, and had lots of other poets in it, but one poet would get 6 or 8 poems in. And, that was kind of my first exposure in print. And so, it was this thing of figuring out how do you, after the first year of the Poetry Forum, in which we were having 2 people read each night and an open mic, nobody was getting paid. It was just people who wanted the spotlight and who the group of poets who put it together thought deserved a spotlight were doing readings. And next year, Cheryl Abdullah, who had been one of the primary movers of getting it started, getting the poetry forum started, applied to the Ohio Arts Council for a grant, and it was basically, we don't pay people for administration. All of this money is going to go to pay poets. And we were paying some, I think at that point, $25 for a reading or $30 for a reading. But at that time, that was money because poets weren't getting paid. And so, there was that. It was, how do we treat these artists, these language artists, as artists? It's not something you do for free. And again, Larry's was a bar, and it was one big room. So if you have a reading in a place like that, you can't charge a door fee because other people who are not coming for poetry walk in and out of the place. Which is why Writer's Block could be so successful where it was. And Poetry Cauldron, which is, you're in a place where there's an entirely separate room with a door between it, and you can control access and ask people to put a couple dollars down to do that. So, we would just pass the hat. And, this is pre-internet. So, we'd print up, okay, here's the next 3 months worth of readings, on flyers, and we'd put them up around. People could pick them up at the readings. It was a slow growing process, but finally one night we had invited Gordon Grigsby, who was a very well-known English professor at OSU, and he was kind of the top man in poetry in the English department there. We invited him in to read, and we hit fire code. I mean, the place, it was freezing out, and the place was packed to the walls. So we said, okay, this thing can work. So, it was figuring out, okay, how do you get people off the mic if they can't tell time? We'd say 2 poems or 5 minutes, which was what we adopted, and 12 readers. And the idea behind that was, you don't want people sitting and sitting and sitting until the audience has drifted away and have the people who are at the bottom end of the list reading to themselves and the bartender and some guy who's passed out at the bar, on the bar stool. So it was, okay, 5 minutes each, a little bit more. Featured reader gets about this much time. We pass the hat. Then it's about an hour after that, and then we're done. We're not going to read till we drop. So it was learning those kinds
of things. So passing the hat, we had talked about that in the pre-interview a little bit. I remember you had said a name, Bill.
Bill Redding, yeah. Bill was just a super guy, and very. I mean, he was tough as nails, but he was a really, really fine, meditative kind of poet, and he wore kind of like a almost like an Irishman's cap, and we would pass that. It was a leather cap, and we'd pass that around, and whatever money was there, okay, that was what the poet got initially. And then we started saying, well, we've got this money from the Arts Council, so we're going to put this money into either paying for copies of flyers, buying equipment if we needed it, which we did eventually. We had some of our own equipment. I had, a good sized speaker and a mic stand, and we bought a new microphone. So, there was money to do those things then. And we were able to store the equipment at Larry's, so it wasn't a thing of schlepping it in and out every week. So that was good. And we just passed Bill's hat. And, this is all pre swipe cards and Square and those kinds of things. So it was cash, or it was loose change. There was a lot of loose change. Occasionally, people would write checks, and we had a bank account, so that worked. But yeah, passing Bill Redding's hat, that's something we did for until the hat just wore out. I mean, we probably used his hat until probably for 15 years, the first 15 years or so.
I like that. So it started at Larry's as far as the forum goes.
Mhm.
And, when I came onto the scene, you were at Bossy Girls. Can you tell me a little bit more as far as the history of the forum?
Sure. We were at Larry's until the early 2000s. So it was right around 2000. At any rate, we were there somewhere between 16 and 20 years. And Larry's it was a famous, renowned place on campus. There were a lot of places where people bar hopped, but Larry's was not a bar hopping place. It was the place where kind of the beats hung out. It was a place where the English grad students and the philosophy grad students and the poli-sci grad students hung out. And sometimes professors brought their grad classes over there and they held class there, late afternoon classes. So it was a place that had chess boards that people could use to, sit in the booths and play chess. And it had a jukebox that had everything from the Grateful Dead to Charlie Parker to Mozart. So it's this incredibly eclectic jukebox. So it was a very cool place. And it was a great place to have as a home. Larry Paoletti, the original Larry, had died, and his two sons had taken it over. Dan, initially. Dan was unable to continue running the bar, and so the younger brother, John, took it over along with his wife, Linda. And with all due respect, I don't think they were ever interested in running a bar. And they certainly didn't understand the clientele the way John's father and his older brother had. And so, we noticed at a certain point, and it was probably around, I think it was about 2008, 2007, 2008. I had noticed, I went in and asked for my usual double Jameson, and the bartender told me, we're out of Jameson. And I just looked at him, and I looked at the line of bottles behind the bar, and I said, the stock looks like it's getting thin. And we stored the equipment in a back room where some of the stock that wasn't behind the bar was kept, and it seemed to be dwindling. And so in December of 2008, Connie Everett, who was one of the coordinators at that time, she asked John, she said, look, we've got are things going okay here? Because we have an entire schedule lined up for the next 6 months into the next year. And John said, oh, yeah, everything's fine. And so I went off to up, northern Michigan to spend Christmas holidays with my sister. And December 28th or so, I called the woman I was dating at the time. She was here in Columbus, and she said, before we start, are you sitting down? I said, do I need to be sitting down? She says, I think so. And she paused for a second and said, Larry's is closing tonight. It was a Saturday. There had been no notice to the regulars. There had been no notice in advance. It was something showed up in the paper that morning that was the last night that Larry's was going to be open. And so, bang, we were out in the cold. Everybody who had been part of Larry's was going to have to find a new place to be. That place had been open since 1940, 60 plus years. For a while, it had a kitchen. And then when we came in there in the 80s, it was supposed to, they would microwave something like a sub sandwich or something in the back, but that gradually had faded away. So we were all shocked. I was furious. And so we very quickly got to work saying, okay, where can we put this thing now? And so, there were certain things we had to be on a bus line. It had to serve alcohol, because that's something that people, our audience had come to consider part of the reading. We found a really good place, a coffee house up in Worthington, which was, right in the central business area of Worthington, just south of Dublin Granville Road, Route 161. But it was a coffee house. They didn't have a liquor license. There was parking. It was ideal in many ways. There were good sight lines, but it was just, I don't think it's going to work. So we kept casting about and finally tapped into, we talked to Todd Dugan, who was the manager up at Rumba Cafe on Summit Street, just south of Hudson. And we said, this is what we want to do. And of course, Mondays had been chosen as the reading night because Mondays are the slack night in the bar business. And so it's more likely that you're going to let somebody come in to draw people in on your slack night for business. And in fact, at one point, we used to take the summers off and just kind of go 9 months and then take some time off, which we really felt we needed. And one July, I got a phone call and I answered the phone and voice said, Steve Abbott? I said, yeah. He said, it's Larry Paoletti. Listen, is there any chance Poetry Forum is going to be having any readings this summer? And what it said was, he's noticed a drop off in income. And so we weren't going to leverage that, but I said, look, Larry, no, this is how we run things at this point. So we ended up going up to Rumba Cafe and had a good run up there. It was really wonderful. Again, not quite enough seating, but great sight lines, a good room, basically a rock and roll room. So there's a small stage and there's a lot of space for people to stand and a few places for them to sit aside from the bar. And they were great. And then probably, it was 2008, probably around 2013 or so, 14, they decided they were going to start bringing in bands on Monday night. But said, well, okay, I think you're crazy, but okay. But one thing that the management there had done is they made a connection with Kobo, which was a place down on High Street, which is now Space Bar, just north of Hudson Street on High Street. We went down to Kobo for a while. Kobo was always less than ideal. There wasn't a lot of money going through the bar. It was kind of rickety financially. The sound system was not particularly good. And in fact, one poet from Cincinnati who is kind of a god in public poetry circles across the country was there one night, and he was scheduled to read in like 3 weeks. And he came up to me afterwards. He said, I won't read here. And we thought, oh, okay, well. And then the next week, we came down there to do the reading, and the place was dark. And it was, what the hell? I called up the number I had, and the guy says, oh, I didn't know you were coming. We said, we're coming every Monday. We've been doing this now for a couple of months. And we're standing out on the sidewalk. It was winter. And my reaction was, oh, to hell with this. We walked 2 doors up the street. Bossy Girls was open, walked in. There were 1 or 2 people in the place and a barkeep. And I asked her, I said, are you the manager or owner? And she said, no. I said, well, here's the situation. Could you call your manager? And she did and said, yeah, here's what they want to do. And okay, we came in and we had a home. So, we worked things out with them, and it was a terrific place for a reading. We just kind of walked in off the street and said, hi, would you host our reading? And suddenly we had a relationship. So Bossy's was just a terrific place. I mean, we loved being there. The management was wonderful. The bartenders were just terrific. We adopted at that point, we may have done it earlier up at Rumba, but it was basically, okay, the bartender gets 10% of the hat. No matter how much it is, the bartender gets 10%. And so some nights that was very good. In addition to whatever tips they were getting from individuals, there was a little vigorish on top of that. Yeah, we really loved being at Bossy's.
I like that. I wish I could have gotten there more. Just from the few times I was there, the crowds, I can see that being nice. And the preponderance of businesses apparently that just closed down without telling anybody anything.
Yeah. Writer's Block went through that with probably 3 places, maybe 4, where they were at Snaps and Taps, and then they were at a place on Parsons Avenue, which had been the Dell restaurant. I don't remember what it was called then. Several iterations later, it became Carabar. And then they were downtown on some place on High Street, just cat a corner from the courthouse. And then they were down at Barrister Hall. And Yeah, these places would just, with no word to people who were essentially regulars. It was,
Yeah.
it's surprising, but I understood it when COVID happened because a lot of things collapsed abruptly then. But when people have built up some clientele, even if it's not enough to sustain the business, you'd think they'd at least give their patrons a heads up to say, okay, sorry, but the show's over.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
what
writer's block. I went through
confuses me.
that multiple times.
COVID, that's an interesting kind of a question I guess I would have. I know that writer's block did online stuff over the pandemic.
Mhm.
Did Forum do that as well?
Yeah, we did Zoom readings. I found them unsatisfactory. Zoom readings during the pandemic were vital in a lot of ways because one, people got to continue having and building audiences in terms of it being something that was not confined to a geographic area. I could hear poets on the West Coast that I never would have heard, or poets in Europe that I never would have heard, and they could attend the reading. We had a regular attendee from Great Britain, another one from Arizona, who would attend the poetry forum. So this one person was getting up at 3 in the morning or something. I don't remember what the time difference was to be at the poetry forum. And so I look at those things and I say, it's great. But for me personally, I've found them wanting for the reason that I look at poetry readings generally, and there are certainly exceptions. I look at it as it's like going to a music concert. You've got to be in the room. It's like you say, I'm going to go see Beyonce or I'm going to go see The Who, and you're not in the room. Well, you're watching them on TV or on a screen somewhere. Well, no, that's okay. Yeah, you're getting to hear them, but you're not getting the experience. And with poetry, because of the intimacy of rooms like that, there's a real energy and dynamic that readers feed off of that I think are essential to the experience. So we shut down for about 8 months, 7 months. At one point, we just stopped doing the online readings. But as COVID started to fade, because we had gone through a good portion of it, my lovely wife Melanie kept saying, "Are you guys gonna get things back up and going? Because you can't let the poetry forum end with a whimper. It's got to go out, and it's got to let people ride it out." And I said, well, as usual, you're right. So, we started pulling things back together and scheduling people. For that last 7 months, it was basically, okay, we're gonna bring out the people who, well, people whose work we really admire, people whose longtime supporters and whose work we find worthy. And those are going to be our readers. We're not going to bring in anybody from out of town, except for, I think we brought in 2 from Dayton, who had been people who had been very close to the poetry forum. But that was the way we were going to go out. We let people know it's going to end on July 31st, and here's the lineup. Be there, because this is only going to happen one time. And it was time. It was time.
If I may, why do you say that?
I believe that artists and events have their own life cycle. I said this a number of times when people would talk to me. I'd say, well, when we started this, it was because we saw a need and we moved to address the need. Well, that need was supplemented by all kinds of other readings that sprang up after the poetry forum got some legs under it. There were readings at the Milo Coffee House, there was Snaps and Taps, there was Peripatetic Poets. Pudding House had a series called The Rattlebox, which would be at different places. And I looked at it as, we didn't start out to set up an institution. We set out to do this thing that was needed. And yes, it's become an institution, but we had looked for someone's, plural, to take it over. And it's not that we didn't want to go to readings anymore. We just thought, okay, this is it. This has had its life cycle. Readings that are starting up now should be able to serve the needs of this particular time. We had tried for several years, just kind of approaching people casually and sometimes a little bit more assertively and saying, so would you be willing to take this thing over? The majority of them And again, they were mostly page poets. Majority of them were in MFA programs, so they'd get their degrees and they'd go look for work, understandably. And we really needed someone who would understand how the poetry form was different from other readings. And Scott Woods, in the piece he wrote up for Matter News, was just, I couldn't have written that. I mean, he saw it from the outside and described it in a way that I think really captured it. And it was just 8 or 10 sentences that said, this is what made it different. We couldn't find anyone who seemed to understand that, who seemed to see this. And maybe it was that thing of it's a page orientation primarily. We had lots of performance and spoken word poets, but it was at base and at its core, it was page based. It was, this is something you can read when you're by yourself, and you can get it when you're by yourself, which again is the difficulty with slam and performance poems on the page. They just don't have that really necessary personality driving the poem as part of its presentation. So we said, it's been a good old dog, but it's time to put the dog down. And it's good for the dog, it's good for us. And that was that.
And that is the end of today's episode. We'd like to give a very special thank you to Steve Abbot for being with us today. Be sure to check out part 2 coming in a few weeks. Also, we'd like to thank you for listening with us today. We hope you enjoyed your time, and we'll talk to you a little bit later.
And then writer's block shut down. And we thought, holy shit, this is a real 1-2 punch. Man, this is Buster Douglas hitting Tyson, It was bam, bam, and suddenly these 2 support columns for a lot of Columbus poetry went off to do other things.
Poems and Potions is produced by Mandar Kath, Marquita Byers, and R. Taryn Lear. Music provided by Charity Dietrich. Sound support provided by A.D. Dietrich. Thank you all, and have a wonderful night.